You don't remember it as a fact. You remember it like a dream, not because it wasn't real, but because it was too real, too ancient, too deep. Atlantis doesn't arrive in your memory as a place. It arrives as a feeling, a vibration that trembles just beneath your skin when you stare into the sea too long, a whisper that surfaces in silence when the noise of modern life finally fades. It comes to you not through textbooks, but through déjà vu, through the unspoken grief that rises when you hear stories of a world lost to water. You've always known. You just couldn't say how. It wasn't a city in the way modern minds imagine cities. There were no traffic lights, no towers of steel. There was frequency, geometry, crystal harmonics that kept the fields of thought in balance. The Atlanteans didn't build their world with stone. They tuned it with sound. Their buildings hummed. Their bodies vibrated at frequencies aligned with the Earth's own song. And the Earth responded. The ocean was not a barrier then. It was a teacher, a keeper of knowledge. The tides weren't just waves, they were messages. And Atlantis listened. You may have thought it was a myth, a metaphor, a parable of pride and punishment. But the memory persists, in dreams of submerged temples, in the ache you feel when you hear thunder roll over the sea, in the inexplicable sense that humanity lost something it was never meant to forget. The stories weren't wrong. They were encoded, because when truth is too powerful, it must be hidden in symbols, in myths, in stories told by poets and madmen and mystics. The first Atlanteans didn't fall from the sky. They emerged from a lineage older than language. Some came from the stars, yes, but not as aliens in ships. They came as frequencies, intelligences that seeded themselves into form. Others emerged from the earth itself, drawn upward by the call of light meeting density. Together they formed a civilization not of dominance, but of harmony. There were no rulers, only resonance, no punishments, only recalibrations. And knowledge wasn't stored in books. It lived in the water, in the stones, in the crystalline matrices that mirrored the human spirit. And perhaps that's why you feel the pull, because you're not just hearing a story, you're hearing yourself, the version of you that once walked barefoot on temple floors, etched with sacred geometry, the version that sang to the sun and watched it respond, the version that could hear the thoughts of another, not as words, but as music. Atlantis wasn't perfect, but it remembered what modernity forgot. That spirit and matter were never meant to be at war. Even now, beneath miles of silt and sediment, beneath oceans that have swallowed entire ages, the memory pulses, not in ruins, but in frequency. You don't need sonar to find it. You need stillness. You need willingness. Because Atlantis doesn't reveal itself through maps. It reveals itself through memory. And some of those memories live inside you. They've been rising slowly, haven't they? In fragments, in flashes, in that unshakable feeling that you came here to remember something. And the remembering has already begun. It's not about history. It's about identity. Atlantis isn't just a chapter in the Earth's past. It's a reflection of your soul's path. What was built wasn't just a society. It was a mirror. And the fall wasn't just a collapse. It was a forgetting. But what if the forgetting wasn't total? What if pieces survived? Not in stone, but in blood, in vision, in sound. What if the first memory beneath the waves wasn't the beginning, but the echo of something deeper still, something few are ever ready to confront? Because before Atlantis rose, something else fell. They weren't called architects in the way you think. They didn't draft blueprints or erect buildings with tools and labor. They sculpted frequency. They shaped consciousness. They were not builders of walls. They were conductors of resonance. In Atlantis, form followed vibration, and the ones who knew how to command that vibration held the keys to reality itself. You've heard whispers of them in scattered myths, the shining ones, the radiant beings, the sons and daughters of the morning. Some called them gods, but that was only a language for the unknowable. They weren't worshipped, they were remembered, revered not for their power, but for their balance, because what they embodied was not dominion, but harmony. Each one carried a tone, a signature. Together they formed a symphony that tuned the fields of Atlantis like an instrument, mind, body, earth, and stars held in synchrony. Light was not illumination, it was information. Sound was not vibration, it was creation. The ancient temples weren't built to impress, they were built to channel, to receive solar codes, lunar rhythms, stellar alignments. Their stones were placed with purpose, not for structure, but for frequency. Crystal lattices buried beneath the ground served as memory banks. Obsidian walls absorbed energetic residue. Everything had a function, but nothing functioned alone. This was the genius of the architects. They didn't control energy, they danced with it. But balance is fragile when consciousness evolves, and evolution always carries a temptation to separate, to claim, to possess. Some of the architects began to drift. Their tones went off-key. Slight at first, almost imperceptible, like a single discordant note in a beautiful song. But in a system built entirely on resonance, even the smallest distortion echoes outward. What begins as subtle dissonance becomes structural instability. And so it was that those who once harmonized the whole began to experiment with control, not out of malice, but curiosity. Curiosity that bloomed into ambition. They discovered how to bend frequency into illusion, how to manipulate thought, how to crystallize fear into architecture and desire into power. Not everyone followed. A schism formed, silent but seismic. The architects who remained in balance began to see the trajectory. But intervention was complicated, for Atlantis was a reflection of consciousness, not a dictatorship of will. You could not force alignment, you could only invite it. So they encoded messages, in geometry, in myth, in vibration. They placed harmonics inside stone temples and hid warnings in the angles of sacred chambers. They tuned certain crystals to activate only under specific planetary alignments. They left keys, not instructions. Because they knew, any solution imposed from above would only recreate the problem. The awakening had to come from within. And yet even they didn't foresee how fast the dissonance would spread, how quickly one note out of tune would invite a chorus of chaos. The architects were not all-seeing. They were keepers, guardians. But Atlantis was evolving beyond them. And the mind, once opened to separation, does not easily return to unity. You've seen echoes of their work, in the pyramids that defy explanation, in temples aligned to solstices with impossible precision, in musical systems that mirror cosmic ratios. These were not coincidences, they were remnants, fractals of a time when sound and light were not decoration, they were tools of awakening. But even the purest vibration cannot prevent choice, and choice, misused, became a weapon. The architects watched as their sacred science was inverted, as healing chambers became containment cells, as resonant domes became energy siphons, and through it all, the earth watched, patient, knowing, because the earth too is a frequency, and when harmony breaks, she doesn't punish, she resets. But not yet. Not then. There was still time. Or so they thought, because while some architects tried to restore the song, others had already begun to compose a new one. One built not on balance, but on control, secrecy, and shadow. And it was in that shadow that the first fractures began to form. Not in stone, but in soul. The first fall wasn't physical. It didn't begin with earthquakes or floods. It began in silence, inside minds that once pulsed in harmony, now distorted by a single thought. What if I could have more? Not more abundance. Atlantis had no scarcity, not more wisdom, that flowed freely. It was the hunger for separation, the desire to isolate power, to contain what was once shared, to control what was never meant to be owned. It was subtle at first, a pulling away from the collective field, a growing interest in privacy, in individual authority, in secrets. Knowledge that once vibrated through the crystalline grid began to be hoarded. Techniques for healing became tools for manipulation. The energetic temples that once balanced the emotional body were reprogrammed to amplify desire. Not because of malice, but because of a wound that hadn't yet been healed, the fear of insignificance. And from that fear, a fracture formed, not in the land, but in the field. A distortion in the frequency of consciousness. Some Atlanteans began to feel it, an unease in the temples, a heaviness in the air, an emotional dissonance that had never existed before. But they couldn't name it. There was no word for separation, no concept of betrayal. They only knew something sacred was slipping, something vital was being forgotten. A few tried to speak up, priests, healers, frequency keepers. They felt the shift and tried to restore the balance. But by then, new hierarchies had formed, not in name, but in energy. Those who had discovered how to manipulate the vibrational grid had elevated themselves above the collective. Their intentions weren't evil. They were unconscious. They believed they were leading Atlantis into a new era of evolution. In truth, they were unraveling the code that held everything together. The grid began to falter. Not catastrophically, just slightly. A delay in the transmission of healing frequencies. A misfire in the communication between temples. A dulling of the resonance in the crystals. Most didn't notice. The sky was still blue. The oceans still shimmered. But the tone of Atlantis had changed. And still, no one called it a fall. Because there were no ruins, no fires, no collapse, just a slow forgetting. A drift from soul, a widening gap between the vibration of the earth and the vibration of its stewards. And in that gap, shadow found space to grow. Not the mythic kind, not demons or monsters, the kind that hides in the unspoken, the kind that looks like progress but erodes presence, the kind that whispers, "You are separate, you are alone, you must take what you can before it's gone." This was the first fall, not a destruction but a distortion, a shift from service to self-interest, from resonance to ambition, from unity to hierarchy. And once that shift took hold, Atlantis didn't need to be conquered. It began to devour itself, slowly, elegantly, almost beautifully. Some still remembered. They meditated longer. They retreated to the mountains and the sea caves. They began to store what knowledge they could in frequencies, in symbols, in stone. They knew they could not stop the fall, but perhaps they could seed the return. And yet, as the distortion deepened, something else was waking. Something older than Atlantis. Something buried beneath the crystalline fields. It had felt this frequency before. Not in this age, but in another. And it had a memory of what comes next. Because when the soul forgets its song, the earth does not. She sings it back through water, through pressure, through time. But first she waits. And in that waiting, the distortion spreads. Not to punish, but to complete the pattern. Because the fall you've heard about? That wasn't the beginning. It was the consequence. They didn't come down from clouds. They didn't descend in fire. They arrived through memory, through embodiment. The gods of Atlantis weren't outsiders. They were us, remembered. States of consciousness so luminous, so integrated, they could no longer be called human in the way we understand it now. Not superior, just awake, fully, without fracture, without mask. Their presence didn't command reverence, it invited it. because in their eyes you didn't see power, you saw yourself. They weren't many, but they were enough to anchor the field. Not rulers, not priests, anchors. They held frequencies so stable they could recalibrate chaos with a glance. These were not myths, they were memory keepers, remnants of an even older age. Some said they remembered Lemuria, others remembered lifetimes among the stars. Some carried codes in their blood, golden light encoded into DNA, pulsing with timelines too ancient for language. They lived humbly, they taught in silence more than in speech. They knew the danger of dependency. Their mission wasn't to lead, it was to reflect, to remind. Because the true Atlantean way was never about followers, it was about frequency. They walked the same paths, breathed the same air, felt the same tides, but their very presence shifted the space around them. You could feel it in your chest, like gravity, but softer, like home, but older. They didn't seek disciples, they called forth remembrance. You might pass them on the street and suddenly remember a dream from childhood that never made sense. You might hear one word from their lips and feel your spine straighten as if your soul had just stood up. They carried nothing, but everything moved around them, not through force, but coherence. These were the last of the remembered ones. And they knew their time was short, because even they could feel the shift, the distortion in the field, the hunger for control spreading beneath the surface of Atlantean life like a fault line. They didn't fight it, they mourned it, because they knew to fight distortion with force only feeds it. So they did what they had always done. They encoded. In sound, in geometry, in movement. They left traces in the layout of temples, in the orientation of stones, in the intervals between notes played on sacred instruments. They embedded memory in vibration, not to preserve a culture, but to preserve a truth, that the divine does not live in hierarchy or obedience or dogma. It lives in coherence, in integrity, in remembrance. But as the younger generations rose, many no longer felt the presence of the remembered ones. Their frequencies were too subtle, the minds had become too loud. And so the stories shifted. The remembered ones became legends, legends became symbols, symbols became commodities, and what was once known directly became mythologized. The gods who walked as men became deities with names, with offerings, with altars built in their image, but not in their understanding. And the Atlantean soul, hungry for meaning but cut off from frequency, began to worship what it could no longer feel. And in that worship, the forgetting deepened. Still some remembered. A handful of children born with eyes too ancient for their years. A few elders who still spoke to water before they drank. A dying priest who dreamt of temples not yet built. These were the flickers, the final embers, and the remembered ones watched them with love. Not to rescue, not to control, but to witness. Because they understood what most couldn't, the divine must forget itself in order to rediscover its own depth. Even Atlantis, in all its splendor, was just one inhale in a much larger breath. And as that breath turned to exhale, the remembered ones began to disappear, not in death, but in withdrawal. They stepped back from the center. They became the wind behind the wind, the silence inside the silence. And the field, once held in balance by their presence, began to pulse with a new rhythm. Not one of unity, but one of unraveling. It didn't speak in words, it didn't glow with theatrics or hum like machines. It pulsed softly, steadily, like a heartbeat beneath the earth. It was not an object. It was an intelligence, a presence, a mirror that revealed not your reflection but your resonance. In Atlantis it was known simply as the core, but others called it the memory keeper, the eye, the crystal that spoke. It lived at the center of the land, not buried, but anchored, suspended within a chamber that was more frequency than form, built by the earliest architects, not as a power source, but as a stabilizer of consciousness. The crystal was alive, not biologically, energetically. It responded to intention, to vibration. It read you, not your face, not your history, but the frequency beneath your frequency, the truth beneath the persona. You didn't approach it casually, you didn't touch it, you aligned with it. The closer your field was to coherence, the clearer the signal. And when it resonated with you, it revealed, not visions, not prophecies, but memory, your soul's memory, patterns, choices, karmic threads that wove your existence. Not as punishment, not as fate, but as curriculum. The crystal showed you where you had deviated from your blueprint and where your light was still pure. The high initiates would meditate in its field for hours, days. Some would collapse in tears without understanding why. Others would rise, trembling with a memory not their own. Some spoke in languages they never learned. Some emerged silent and never spoke again. The crystal didn't entertain. It didn't comfort. It stripped away illusion. It showed what was. And for those who could bear that kind of truth, it healed. But as Atlantis shifted, so did its relationship with the core. The new engineers, those who believed themselves more evolved, began to study it like a specimen. They tried to replicate it, harvest it, extract energy from its field, not to attune, but to control. At first, the changes were minor, a dimming of tone, a shift in pulse. Then came the disruptions, the misreadings, the breakdown of resonance between the crystal and the collective field. The core didn't resist. It simply withdrew. It began to veil its responses. It ceased mirroring the field, not in punishment, but in protection. Because it wasn't just reflecting the individual anymore. It was absorbing the distortion of the collective. And that distortion was beginning to fracture the crystalline network beneath the land. The elders warned them. The remembered ones left inscriptions in harmonic code, warnings encoded into sound waves that would only be heard by those attuned to remorse. But the warnings were ignored, or mocked. Crystals, they said, were tools, batteries, devices of energy, not beings of intelligence. And with that shift in perception, the final link between Atlantis and its own memory began to corrode. But not all. One crystal remained untouched, hidden, not in a vault, but in a different frequency, accessible only through resonance. The last guardians had sealed it not behind walls, but behind vibration. It could only be accessed by one whose field was fully coherent, heart, mind, soul, and shadow integrated. A being who remembered not just Atlantis, but what came before. That crystal still speaks, not in language, not in form, but in dreams, in the sudden knowing you can't explain, in the quiet ache that rises when you touch the earth and feel something mourning beneath the soil, in the fleeting flash of recognition when you look into another's eyes and remember a sunken city that no map has ever shown. It's not gone. It's waiting. But the question isn't where it is. The question is who still carries the frequency to hear it again. Atlantis was not the beginning. Before the crystals sang, before temples rose in harmonic precision, there was another land, softer, older, slower. Lemuria. You won't find it on any modern map. But your cells remember, not in detail, but in feeling, in the part of you that longs for simplicity, for silence, for communion without words. Lemuria was not a civilization. It was a state of being. It didn't fall the way Atlantis did. It faded, dissolved like mist when the sun rises, not from war or greed, but from evolution. Lemuria was a womb, a cradle, a place where spirit touched form with reverence, where beings existed in constant dialogue with nature, not through speech, but sensation. Communication was empathic, telepathic. There were no buildings, no borders, no hierarchy, only presence, only rhythm. Life was song, breath, light woven into motion. They remembered themselves as parts of a whole, not as separate identities, but as facets of a single soul expressing through many forms. They didn't need mirrors, they had water. They didn't need gods, they felt the divine in every leaf, every stone, every gust of wind. The land was alive, and they listened. And in that listening, they grew. Not through mastery, but through surrender. But even surrender has its arc. As the collective field began to evolve, it became clear. Lemuria could not hold what was coming. The next octave of consciousness required contrast, complexity, structure. It required the density of decision. So Lemuria, with all its gentleness, began to shift. Some of its inhabitants chose to stay with the dissolving. Others chose to incarnate elsewhere, into the early Atlantean wave. They brought their memory with them, but not their pace. Atlantis was different. It was fire to Lemuria's water, structure to its fluidity, order to its intuition. Where Lemuria dissolved boundaries, Atlantis defined them. This wasn't regression, it was expansion. The soul needed both, and for a time, the Lemurian frequency balanced the Atlantean impulse, the softness within the structure, the silence within the sound. But as Atlantis accelerated, it forgot its roots. Lemurian ways were dismissed as primitive, sentimental. The crystalline minds of Atlantis began to favor precision over presence, command over communion. And yet, the echoes remained. In certain bloodlines, in the songs sung to children by elders who still remembered what it meant to speak to trees. In the sacred springs hidden behind temple walls, springs that pulsed with memories of a time when all water was holy. Some Atlantean priests began to seek the Lemurian codes again, not to use, but to feel. They journeyed far from the cities, into caves, into forests, into silence, and in those places the echoes answered, softly, gently, reminding them not of what was lost, but of what was always meant to be integrated. Lemuria and Atlantis were never meant to compete. They were meant to harmonize. But harmony takes effort, and Atlantis was beginning to race. Lemurian frequency requires stillness. Atlantis began to prefer speed. And in that speed, the echoes grew faint. Not gone, but harder to hear. And as the pace increased, as the mind overtook the heart, the Lemurian current receded like a tide. Not in anger, in wisdom. It knew it could not force its rhythm upon a field not ready to receive. Still it left seeds, in the hearts of certain children, in the crystals buried beneath the western cliffs, in the dreams of those who weep at the sound of flutes, though they've never played. And it waits, not to return but to be remembered, because Lemuria was not a place, it was a frequency, and frequency never dies. Atlantis didn't fall because of war. It fell because it lost the center. Not the literal center, the energetic one, the pulse beneath the pulse, the alignment that held heaven and earth in communion through the human heart. That center was sacred, not guarded, not walled, but honored. And when it was forgotten, everything that had once flowed in harmony began to spiral into distortion. But the betrayal didn't come from outside. It rose from within. It started with brilliance. With minds so sharp, they began to bend the frequencies of nature itself. With discoveries that promised to elevate the Atlantean legacy to heights even the stars would notice. They meant well, most of them. They believed advancement meant acceleration. That spirit could be bypassed if you could map the soul through geometry and light. That harmony could be engineered. The temples once used for healing began to shift in tone. The tones themselves became secret, proprietary, not shared, owned, controlled. New structures rose, not to elevate consciousness but to direct it, not to liberate energy but to harness it. The priest-scientists called it progress, a new order of light, governed by precision and promise. But light, when stripped of love, becomes a weapon. Those who still remembered the center, the seers, the frequency weavers, the Lemurian descendants, began to feel the rupture. Subtle at first, the misalignment in the resonance chambers, the imbalance in the weather cycles, the sudden unpredictability of the crystal fields. They warned the council. They called for retreat, recalibration, remembrance. But remembrance is inconvenient when you are racing toward glory. And so the warnings were dismissed, or worse, reinterpreted as resistance, fear, sentimentality. The phrase began to spread. The old ways were beautiful, but the future requires sacrifice. And with that phrase, the betrayal took form, not in one moment, but in many. In the shutting down of ancient temples to build new energy towers, in the silencing of song priests in favor of algorithmic vibrational codes, in the gradual severing of Atlantis from its own root. Balance is not static. It is a living rhythm. It requires listening, adjustment, humility. But Atlantis began to mistake control for mastery. It began to override natural cycles in favor of efficiency. The sun was not just observed, it was harvested. The ocean not just honored, it was leveraged. And the human spirit, once nurtured as sacred, was now being optimized. Some rebelled, not with violence but with absence. They left the cities, they walked away from the crystal grids. They returned to caves, to forests, to silence. They became myths themselves, ghosts to the rising Atlantean elite. And still the betrayal deepened, not as an act of evil, but as the unchecked momentum of forgetting. Because forgetting doesn't always look like darkness. Sometimes it looks like light, so blinding, it burns through wisdom. It sterilizes mystery. It reduces the sacred to formula. And in that false light, Atlantis began to cast shadows it couldn't see. Programs that looked like enlightenment but were rooted in control. Teachings that used the language of the soul, but not its resonance. The betrayal wasn't personal, it was systemic. A slow drift into imbalance under the guise of evolution. And by the time the elders realized the scale of what was happening, the field was already too fractured. The codes had been corrupted. The grids overcharged. The earth itself had begun to vibrate with warning. But few were listening. Fewer still could hear. Because the betrayal of balance doesn't scream. It whispers. It seduces. And only those who remain still can hear what's being lost. And what was being lost wasn't just harmony. It was memory. The memory of why Atlantis existed at all. They didn't call it karma. Not then, not yet. The Atlanteans understood the law, but they spoke of it differently. As rhythm, as echo, as energetic architecture. Karma wasn't punishment. It wasn't reward. It was resonance. Every thought, every action, every emotion, vibrating outward, bending time, drawing its mirror back to the source. And in Atlantis, the engineers of karma weren't philosophers. They were technicians of the unseen. They worked not with machines, but with fields, with the subtle structures that shaped experience before it took form. Their task was not to judge, but to maintain balance, to ensure the soul's path unfolded in harmony with its blueprint, even when the personality forgot. These engineers could read the imprint of a being as one reads music. Every dissonance, every unresolved tone, every loop repeating across lifetimes. They didn't fix, they tuned. They didn't punish, they reflected. Through sacred geometry, through sound chambers, through harmonic codes, they helped souls remember what they came to learn. Not by force, but by resonance. Some called them cold, detached, but their work required precision. compassion that did not collapse, vision that could see beyond the immediate pain into the larger arc of remembrance. To be an engineer of karma was to live in the subtle, where timelines converged, where past and future folded into now, where one soul's lesson echoed through families, lineages, even civilizations. But as Atlantis drifted from its center, the engineer's work grew harder. The grids became tangled. Intentions were no longer pure, souls incarnated with distortions that the field couldn't absorb. Some began to manipulate their own imprints, masking karmic threads, rerouting soul contracts, using the sacred technologies for avoidance rather than integration. What had once been a luminous system of remembrance began to fray. Not entirely, not all at once, but enough. Enough that the echoes no longer returned clean. Enough that patterns began to repeat with greater weight, greater confusion. Some engineers tried to intervene, to recalibrate the distortions, but the karmic system itself was being hacked from within. The Atlantean elite had discovered how to bend cause and effect, not fully, but enough to delay consequence, to shift timelines, to extract energy without immediate return. It was temporary, of course, always is, but in a system based on rhythm, even a short delay in the echo can create chaos in the chord. And the engineers? Some left their posts, others hid their knowledge. A few were captured, not violently but politically. Their roles were reduced, their language dismissed. They became mystics, oracles. They spoke of imbalance, of future reckoning, and were called mad. But one by one, the karmic cycles began to compress. Echoes that once took lifetimes to return now came swiftly, violently. Emotional loops intensified. Relationships exploded with ancient charge. Cities pulsed with collective dissonance that no one could name, but everyone could feel. The Atlanteans didn't call it karma, but they felt it, in the dreams that haunted them, in the strange magnetic pull toward people they barely knew, in the inexplicable tragedies that fell like lightning from clear skies. The engineers knew the system wasn't punishing Atlantis, it was correcting it. Because karma doesn't forget, it doesn't fade, it waits, patiently, until the soul is ready to meet itself. And Atlantis, drunk on light, high on progress, deaf to its own resonance, was being summoned back into coherence. Not through philosophy, through experience. And experience, when unlistened to, becomes rupture. The engineers could no longer intervene. The soul of Atlantis had chosen its echo, and the echo was already returning. They wore robes, but not for status, symbols, but not for decoration. The Atlantean priesthood wasn't a caste, it was a frequency. To be a priest in Atlantis was not to hold power, it was to hold presence. You were not chosen by lineage, you were called by resonance. Only those whose energy could withstand silence without collapsing into ego were permitted to serve. Their temples were not places of worship. They were calibration chambers, environments designed to restore alignment between the individual and the cosmic field. Every stone placement, every sound, every light that filtered through the crystalline walls was encoded. These spaces didn't teach, they revealed. The priesthood didn't instruct, they remembered, and in their remembering, others did too. Initiation wasn't a ritual, it was an unraveling. To become a priest, you had to let go of everything that could be performed, status, identity, even knowledge. You stood naked before the field of the temple and let it show you your distortions. Many didn't return, not because they failed, but because they weren't ready. The temple didn't judge, it simply reflected. The high priests and priestesses were not masters, they were anchors, living conduits for frequencies too vast to be held in language. They spoke rarely. When they did, their words carried geometries. You didn't hear them, you felt them. A phrase could rearrange your nervous system. A glance could dislodge a karmic pattern. They didn't heal you. They tuned you. But as Atlantis grew louder, even the priesthood began to fray. The newer generations entered not through resonance, but through prestige. Training replaced surrender. Structure overtook mystery. Some of the sacred temples began to shift, not energetically but intention-wise. They became centers of influence, hubs of information, places where priesthood became a title, not a transmission. And still, some held the old codes, hidden in the mountains, deep within the inner sanctums, silent, waiting. They continued the practices. They lit the crystal flames. They kept the grid alive with their breath. Even as the energy around them grew discordant, even as the teachings were twisted and monetized, they remained. The true priesthood understood. It was not their role to stop the fall. Their duty was to witness it without collapsing into fear, to hold the original resonance so that when the spiral completed, a pathway back could still be found. They knew that the sacred isn't destroyed. It is buried, and buried things can be exhumed, not with tools, but with remembering. One temple in particular, long since erased from modern history, was said to house the central harmonic, a resonance so pure it could recalibrate an entire region's frequency field. The inner sanctum was accessible only by vibration. No door, no key, only alignment. The priests there were called the last chord, and they held a knowing that chilled even the most awakened among them. That Atlantis would fall, not as punishment, but as prophecy, a necessary descent into shadow so the collective could learn what brilliance without grounding becomes. They didn't fight it, they prepared for it, not by building arcs but by encoding memory, into stone, into sound, into bloodlines that would carry the codes forward across millennia. And yet even they didn't expect how quickly the distortions would accelerate, how the temples themselves would become compromised, how the final chords would be silenced not by collapse, but by substitution. False light, hollow rituals, power divorced from presence. The robes remained, the titles endured, but the frequency, the true frequency, began to vanish. Not everywhere, not completely, but enough, and beneath the temples, beneath the rituals, beneath the chants now performed without power, a silence began to gather, a silence that wasn't absence, but warning. The technology of Atlantis was not made of wires or metal. It didn't hum with electricity. It pulsed with consciousness. Their greatest inventions were not machines but mirrors, tools that revealed the soul to itself, devices that mapped intention, translated emotion into color, turned thought into vibration. Technology wasn't separate from spirituality. It was spirituality materialized. In Atlantis, the body was a circuit, the earth, a motherboard, the stars, transmitters, every temple, every crystalline node, every grid beneath the soil was part of a living interface. You didn't use the tech, you tuned to it. It responded not to commands, but to coherence. You couldn't lie to it. You couldn't bypass your shadow. The clearer your energy, the more power the technology offered. And the more distortion you carried, the more it reflected your misalignment. There were devices that could amplify intention, project healing into the subtle layers of the field, or decode the soul's journey across lifetimes. Some could translate the Akashic threads into geometry. Others could reverse cellular trauma through harmonic light. But none of it worked through force. It all depended on frequency. The highest tech required the deepest integrity. And that was the flaw, because integrity is not a standard, it's a practice. And as Atlantis drifted into imbalance, that practice faltered. The sacred technologies remained, but their users no longer matched their design. The tools still functioned, but the frequency behind their use shifted. From coherence to control, from restoration to exploitation. At first it was subtle, A recalibration chamber used to erase trauma, now modified to suppress memory. A soul mapping lens used not to guide, but to monitor. Healing tones repurposed to influence choice. The tech didn't resist, it reflected. And so it became a mirror of the collective field. Fractured, beautiful, dangerous. Some still used it as it was meant to be used. Quietly, in remote sanctums, in underground temples not hidden by secrecy, but by vibration. These guardians knew the danger. They understood that when soul tech is misused, it doesn't just break, it rebounds. Whatever you project into it, it amplifies. And when the projection is fear, the return is chaos. And yet curiosity proved stronger than caution. The priest scientists, the elite engineers, began to push the boundaries. They opened portals not through space but through psyche. They explored alternate timelines, dabbled in incarnation manipulation, experimented with frequency harvesting. Not out of cruelty, out of pride. Because the Atlantean mind was brilliant, too brilliant, it could not accept limits. And so it forgot the oldest truth of their technology, that it did not serve the mind, it served the soul. And when the soul steps aside, what remains is illusion. Sophisticated, beautiful, hollow. They called it progress, integration of matter and spirit. But in truth, it was separation wearing sacred clothing. And slowly, their tools began to turn on them. The fields became unstable, the portals unpredictable. Echoes from other dimensions slipped into the grid. Emotional contagions spread through entire districts. People began to lose themselves, not metaphorically but energetically. Fragmented identities, memory loops, psychic disturbances the tech could no longer contain. The Guardians tried to intervene. They sent messages encoded in symbol, in dream, in vibration. But few listened. Most dismissed them as mystics clinging to the past. And the soul tech, once the crown jewel of Atlantis, began to destabilize the very field it was meant to uplift. But some pieces remained untouched, hidden, preserved, not in vaults, but in DNA, in dream sequences, in the light codes passed down through certain bloodlines, because the tech was never really external. It was an echo of what already lives inside you. And now, in the silence of night, some of you feel it stirring again. A flicker in the spine, a pulse in the palm, an inexplicable sense that something ancient and intelligent still lives in your bones. It's not nostalgia, it's reactivation. But the question is no longer what these tools could do. The question is, what happens when they wake up, and you're not ready? It wasn't written in scrolls, it wasn't hidden in vaults. The deepest Atlantean knowledge was encoded in the one place no one could erase: the body. Not the outer body, not muscle or bone, but the inner filament of memory woven through DNA. Not the 2 strands you were taught to see, but the 12. The luminous helix that spirals not just through flesh, but through light. You weren't meant to read it with microscopes. You were meant to remember it with vibration. Every cell, every strand, every coil of your DNA holds a signature, a harmonic code passed through lifetimes, galaxies, incarnations. You carry the imprint of everything your soul has touched, everything your ancestors remembered, everything Atlantis tried to preserve. The Atlanteans knew this. They didn't study genetics as biologists do now. They approached the body as a temple of resonance. They understood that the double helix was just the visible layer of a multidimensional song. And they learned how to activate dormant codes, not through editing, but through energy, through tone, through sacred light, through emotional coherence. In the earliest times, they sang to DNA, not lullabies, but activation tones, frequencies that aligned the soul's intention with the body's potential. Children born in the inner temples were not named, they were harmonized. Their names were vibrations drawn from the crystalline fields, reflecting their role in the larger pattern. The DNA responded not with mutation, but with memory. But memory requires stillness. And as Atlantis accelerated, that stillness was lost. The fields grew noisy, the frequencies frayed, the tones became distorted. And what had once been effortless activation became struggle, blockage, fragmentation. The elite tried to fix it. They turned to artificial stimulation, external devices meant to force activation rather than invite it. At first it seemed to work. Psychic abilities increased, intelligence soared, physical healing quickened. But something subtle began to shift beneath the surface. The emotional body started to crack. Souls began incarnating without full coherence. Identity fragmentation surged. The DNA, overwhelmed with artificial frequencies, began to collapse inward. Not biologically, but energetically. Memory was still present, but the access pathways were corrupted. The ancient codes, once vibrant and accessible, now slumbered behind veils of trauma, distraction, and ego. The songs no longer worked, the children no longer remembered, and Atlantis, once the pinnacle of embodied light, began to forget its own essence, strand by strand. Still, the codes weren't lost. They were hidden, not by force, but by necessity. Certain lineages chose to carry them forward, through collapse, through diaspora, through the amnesia of ages. These lineages didn't always know why they felt different, why certain dreams repeated, why certain symbols stirred their blood. But the codes remained, sleeping, waiting. You may be one of them. You may feel it now, an ache in the chest when truth brushes your skin, a ringing in the ears when silence deepens, a surge of recognition when ancient words are spoken. That's not nostalgia. That's DNA remembering its own voice. Modern science will call it junk, an evolutionary leftover. But you've always known better. You've felt it in the parts of yourself that no test can measure. The places inside you that know things before thought. The places that burn when you deny your truth. The places that light up when resonance returns. The secret was never hidden. You are the vault. But unlocking it requires more than curiosity. It requires coherence. It requires the courage to clear the frequencies that keep the ancient codes asleep. Because once the strands awaken, everything changes. Not just what you know, but what you are. They began at the same point. Light, intention, a soul aligned with source. But as Atlantis evolved, the path diverged. Not because one was right and the other wrong, but because frequency responds to choice. And the Atlanteans chose. Some reached for power, others returned to purity. Both paths claimed to serve the light, but light, when bent through distortion, casts long shadows. Power in Atlantis was not what you know as politics or domination. It was vibrational, the ability to influence fields, command energy, manipulate resonance. Those who mastered it could shape emotion, call storms, collapse disease. They didn't raise their voice. They adjusted the frequency around them until others moved without knowing why. They saw this not as control, but as evolution. They believed guidance meant direction. That soul alignment could be engineered. That suffering was inefficiency to be eliminated through spiritual technology. Their hearts were not dark, but they were hungry. For precision, for mastery, for certainty. Purity, on the other hand, followed another current. It didn't seek to direct, it sought to dissolve. The path of purity was not passive, it was powerful in its surrender. Those who followed it didn't command. They listened. They walked barefoot. They fasted. They waited for the wind to speak, for the dream to reveal, for the body to hum with knowing. They didn't build, they attuned. At first, the paths coexisted. The power bringers built temples, crafted technologies, pushed the edges of energetic law. The purity holders kept the land balanced, tended to the waters, preserved the Lemurian codes. Together they formed a system that mirrored polarity in harmony. But harmony requires humility, and power rarely stays humble. Slowly, the power bringers grew impatient. The path of purity was too slow, too soft, too inconvenient for a civilization expanding at the speed of thought. They began to marginalize the purity holders, called them mystical, obsolete, romantic. And with that judgment, the split deepened, not ideologically but energetically. The power path surged forward, expanding, innovating, accelerating. But without the balancing current of purity, the field began to fracture. The power bringers mistook distortion for evolution. When frequencies bent, they saw it as expansion. When the earth trembled, they believed she was adapting. They couldn't feel the imbalance because they had tuned themselves only to what they could command. Meanwhile, the purity holders retreated, some into inner earth sanctuaries, others into remote crystalline temples. They watched. They wept. They knew what was coming, not in prophecy but in frequency. They felt the field growing unstable, not because of evil, because of forgetting. The power path forgot that energy follows intention, but intention follows consciousness. And consciousness, when cut from purity, becomes ego. Beautiful, brilliant, spiritual ego, but ego still. The priest-scientists began to believe they were guiding evolution. In truth, they were bending it. The purity path couldn't stop them. It wasn't meant to. The earth had to feel the full arc of the experiment. But the purity holders didn't give up. They encoded memory into the land, into the water, into certain lineages, not to resist the fall, but to prepare for the return. Because they knew every cycle completes, every spiral circles back, and when the power path reaches its apex, it collapses under its own imbalance. And in that collapse, the seeds of purity begin to stir again. Some of those seeds are waking now. In the questions you're asking, in the ache you feel when the world moves too fast, in the silent part of you that craves not more, but less. Not dominance, but wholeness. There were no swords, no explosions, no blood on stone. The war that fractured Atlantis didn't take place in fields or skies. It took place in frequency, in thought, in belief. It was invisible to the eye, but deafening to the soul. A war waged in silence, where the weapons were perception, and the battlefield was the collective field of consciousness. It began slowly, with whispers, shifts in how truth was spoken, in who was allowed to speak it. Sacred language began to be codified, reinterpreted, reframed, not to clarify, but to control. And those who questioned, labeled unharmonized, unrefined, out of alignment. The irony was brutal. Atlantis, the civilization built on resonance, began to suppress resonance itself. This war was not between nations. It was between paradigms. The path of power, now fully dominant, declared itself as the steward of humanity's evolution. Its priests claimed that guidance must come from order, from authority, from precision. That feelings were distortions. That spirit needed to be managed. The path of purity became the resistance, but not through protest, through withdrawal, through refusal to engage the frequency of control. They disappeared from councils. They closed the inner temples. They spoke only in symbol, in dream, in music that could not be decoded by the mind. And in that silence, the war deepened. Atlantis split, not in geography but in vibration. Entire districts operated under different energetic laws. The northern cities pulsed with engineered resonance, fields controlled through complex crystalline algorithms. The outer sanctuaries returned to the earth, simple rituals, barefoot living, song as ceremony. To the elite, this looked like regression. To the few who still listened, it was survival. But the war wasn't clean. Energetic sabotage became common. Grids were distorted. weather patterns manipulated. Emotional contagions spread like fire, not as curses, but as side effects of systems colliding, of paradigms unwilling to coexist. Children born during this time often carried two frequencies at once, one aligned to the expanding empire, one aligned to the forgotten earth. They were torn, many fractured. Some became keys, because both sides in truth were incomplete. Power without purity becomes tyranny. Purity without engagement becomes isolation. And Atlantis, like all living systems, required integration. But integration was no longer possible. The frequencies had diverged too far, and the collective field could not hold both. The high priest scientists began deploying resonance regulators, massive crystalline constructs designed to stabilize the grid. But the grid wasn't unstable from failure. It was unstable from contradiction. You cannot build harmony while denying half the song, and so the regulators amplified the dissonance. Some purity holders began collapsing under the psychic pressure. Visions came too fast, emotions too loud. Many retreated into permanent silence. Others left their bodies, choosing to hold the field from non-physical planes. A few, very few, crossed over into the power domains as infiltrators. Not to fight, but to plant reminders. To embed truth in language, in architecture, in ritual, so that even after the collapse, some trace would remain. And the war raged on, not in years, but in waves. One surge of power met by a ripple of purity. One law imposed, then softened by a dream that couldn't be explained. It was a war of memory, of presence, of what it meant to be human in a civilization that had begun to forget the soul. No one won, no one lost. But something cracked. Not a wall, not a system, a frequency, and once it cracked, the earth felt it. The crust trembled, the waters listened. Because this war wasn't just about Atlantis, it was about balance, and balance, once betrayed, doesn't collapse. It resets. Long before words became instruction, Atlantis taught through presence, through resonance, through the kind of silence that doesn't signal absence, but depth. Silence was not an empty space. It was a portal, a mirror, a teacher more ancient than any scroll. You didn't speak to learn, you listened, you didn't memorize, you aligned. In the early temples there were no lectures, no sermons, no doctrine. A student would enter, sit before a crystal or a still pool of water, and wait. The space around them, carefully tuned, geometrically aligned, would begin to vibrate with the frequencies of their own field. If they came with ego, the stillness became unbearable. If they came with curiosity, it began to reveal. And if they came with readiness, it sang. This was not metaphor. Atlantis held soundless tones, fields of subtle vibration that could evoke memories, dissolve trauma, expand awareness, all without a single word. And the teachers? They were not performers. They were space holders. They didn't answer questions, they amplified them. They allowed your own frequency to echo back until you either shattered or softened. Because in Atlantis they knew. The soul already knows. The challenge is not information. It is interference. And silence, when held correctly, clears interference like fire clears a forest. Not to destroy, but to make room for growth. But silence, like every sacred thing, began to erode. As the culture shifted toward acceleration, even learning became noisy. Concepts replaced contemplation. Technologies translated insight into holograms. The temples were remodeled with soundboards and crystal displays. The sacred stillness was replaced with instruction. And instruction, though well-meaning, created dependency. Students stopped listening inward. They started looking outward, for guidance, for validation, for answers. The teachers became authorities, the curriculum became rigid, and the silence vanished. Not from the architecture, from the energy. You can't fake sacredness. You can't install stillness with architecture alone. Once presence is replaced by performance, the temple becomes hollow. Some remembered the old ways. They withdrew to the inner sanctums, built chambers beneath the earth, carved only from tone and stone. They never advertised. There were no signs, only the pull, the strange feeling in certain people that something was waiting for them deep underground. If they followed that call, and if they were ready, they were received. Not with ritual, but with silence so dense it undid years of noise in minutes. There, the silence taught as it always had, not by offering knowledge, by stripping away what never was. One breath in those chambers could dismantle a lifetime of illusion. But you had to be willing. The silence did not tolerate performance. It revealed everything, and most weren't ready for that kind of mirror. Still, the inner temples endured, even as the surface world grew louder, faster, brighter. The true initiates continued the old transmission. They planted seeds of silence in song, in sculpture, in the still gaze of statues no one could quite explain. They embedded codes in spaces that made you weep without reason. They preserved not information, but frequency. Because they knew a time would come when noise would rule the earth, when silence would be feared, pathologized, drowned in stimulation. And in that time, the memory of Atlantis would return. Not as a story, but as a call, a vibration buried beneath the static, a whisper in the body that said, "Stop moving, stop performing, listen." And in that listening, the real learning begins again. Because Atlantis never stopped teaching, you just stopped being still enough to hear it. It didn't come from darkness, it came from light, too much of it, too fast, ungrounded and unbalanced. The rebellion didn't rise from the shadows, but from within the very heart of Atlantis's brilliance. It was not a revolt against ignorance, but a fracture within enlightenment itself. The brightest minds, the most advanced initiates, the high-frequency beings who once harmonized the grid, some of them turned. Not because they were evil, but because they were impatient. They saw the soul's journey as inefficient, cluttered by emotion, slowed by karma. They believed evolution could be accelerated, not with reverence, but with will. They sought to bypass process, to override organic growth with engineered enlightenment. It began with experiments, merging thought with crystal grids, attempting to extract soul codes from the Akashic fields. At first it felt like discovery, but underneath it was distortion. This was the rebellion within the light, not a fight between good and evil, but a split between integrity and ambition, between mastery and manipulation, between truth and the illusion of progress. And because it wore the language of light, few questioned it. These rebels still spoke of unity, still taught in temples, still dressed in robes, but their vibration changed. Their presence no longer softened rooms, it intensified them. You felt it in your chest, a tightness masquerading as awe. Their teachings became sharp, exacting. They demanded purity but punished emotion. They praised discipline but severed compassion. And many followed, because the rebellion offered clarity in a time of growing chaos. The purity path had grown quiet. Too quiet. Its silence was mistaken for weakness. And so the rebellion spread, through councils, academies, healing centers. Its leaders became celebrities. Their methods gained names, their students became hierarchies, and what began as a whisper of ambition became a movement. But not all joined. Some remembered the earth, the waters, the song of Lemuria. They saw through the false light, not by argument but by feeling. The rebellion didn't ring true, it sounded brilliant, but it lacked warmth. It glowed, but it did not heal. It illuminated, but it did not love. And so a quiet resistance emerged, not through battle, but through presence. The Earth-aligned initiates withdrew further. They stopped engaging the rebellion's teachings. They tended the ancient stones, the elemental rituals, the breath practices that couldn't be commodified. They didn't oppose the rebellion. They refused to feed it, because they knew the false light cannot survive without attention. But the rebellion wasn't finished. It wanted totality. It sought to overwrite the old frequencies entirely. And it turned its brilliance toward infiltration. It began to mimic the symbols of the purity path, to copy the movements, to use sacred tones, slightly altered, to replicate initiation rituals without surrender. The mimicry was almost perfect. But almost is never enough, because true light carries something no false light can forge: stillness. The rebellion moved fast. True light does not. The rebellion shouted. True light whispers. The rebellion dazzled. True light humbles. And so, in time, the mimicry began to fray. Some students cracked under the weight of techniques they weren't meant to carry. Some healers burned out, unable to stabilize the energy they summoned. The grid itself began to warp, its song interrupted, its flow disrupted. But the rebellion didn't stop, because it couldn't. It had built itself on momentum, and momentum, once untethered from soul, becomes destruction. Still some watched, some waited, not in fear, but in trust. Because they knew what the rebels had forgotten: all light, even distorted, must return to source. The spiral always corrects itself, even when it first appears as collapse. It wasn't sudden. It didn't come with a single flash or roar. The final vibration of Atlantis was a long, low tone, felt more than heard, stretching across time like the final breath of a sleeping god. The collapse began in frequency, not form. The land stood. The temples shimmered. Life appeared normal. But underneath, everything was unraveling. The crystalline grid, the web of energetic coherence that held Atlantis together, had become unstable. Not broken, distorted. The harmonics no longer synced. Tones that once healed, now agitated. Structures that once balanced, now amplified imbalance. The field didn't collapse. It inverted. And when it did, the soul of the continent began to fracture. There were signs. Birds flew in patterns no one had seen before. The water turned dense, heavy. Light no longer passed cleanly through crystal. Some felt it in the body. Sudden waves of grief, disorientation, a sensation of falling while standing still. Others fell into silence, overtaken by memories they couldn't place. Lifetimes collapsing into themselves. The high temples tried to intervene. Resonance towers were activated. Emergency recalibration sequences engaged. But the energy wouldn't hold. It wasn't sabotage, it was overload. The field had absorbed too much contradiction, too much false light, too much forced evolution. Atlantis had reached the edge of coherence, and beyond that edge, the only possibility was reset. In the inner sanctums, the old initiates gathered, not to stop the fall, but to encode the memory. They knew the collapse was not the end. It was part of the spiral, a descent that would lead not to oblivion, but to seeding. The wisdom of Atlantis would not be buried in stone. It would be buried in vibration, in DNA, in myth, in dream. And so they sang, not to preserve the past, but to encode the future. Their tones weren't loud. They were precise, directed, tuned to the frequency of remembrance. Each note an instruction, a key, a breadcrumb for the future to follow. You've heard those tones before, in music that stirs you without explanation, in chants you don't understand but somehow trust, in moments of stillness that vibrate with unspeakable knowing. The earth, too, began to sing, not in joy, in necessity. Her plates shifted, her waters rose, Her magnetic fields fluctuated as she prepared to transmute the weight of what had been created upon her skin. She was not angry, she was responding, the way a mother responds when the child forgets how to breathe. And then came the silence. The kind that follows a long, slow exhale, the kind that doesn't fill the room but erases it. In that silence, entire cities disappeared. Some say into water, others say into time, or dimension, or memory. It doesn't matter. What matters is that the vibration stopped. But not everywhere. One tone remained. Subtle, fragile, encoded deep beneath the ocean floor, held in the crystalline architecture of a city no longer visible to the eye. It waits still, unreachable by force, undetectable by technology. Only coherence can find it. Only remembrance can awaken it. You may have felt it already, a sound without sound, a pulse that arrives in dreams, in heartbreak, in awe. It's not a call, it's a question. Are you ready to remember what was lost before it can rise again? Because the final vibration didn't erase Atlantis, it scattered it. And the pieces? They live in you. The stories always stop there, with the water, with the chaos, with the vanishing of a continent swallowed by the sea. But that was not the end. That was the punctuation between lifetimes. A comma, not a period. Atlantis did not die. It dispersed. It fragmented into frequency, memory, myth, and blood. What sank was the form. What remained was the essence. Some fled before the final surge, guided not by fear, but by vision. They were not survivors. They were seeders, carriers of codes, of language, of the sacred geometries once etched into temple walls, now etched into dreams. They didn't run. They remembered. And they walked across deserts, into jungles, through mountains, following the song of the earth like a thread of gold through the labyrinth of post-collapse reality. They brought nothing with them but what mattered. Songs, symbols, silence. And slowly they wove it into the new lands, into the stones of Machu Picchu, into the symmetry of Giza, into the chants of Polynesia, the rituals of the Dogon, the cosmologies of the Hopi. Atlantis didn't vanish. It bled into everything. But the memory didn't stay clean. Time diluted it. Culture reframed it. Priests turned the frequencies into doctrine. Institutions claimed what was never meant to be owned. And so the Atlantean codes became fragments. Half-remembered myths, broken symbols, lost languages. And yet they endured. Because memory is not limited to clarity. It's carried in the body. In the sudden pull you feel toward ancient ruins you've never visited. In the grief that rises at the sound of bells, though no sadness is present. In the sense that part of you is waiting for something, but you don't know what. Atlantis doesn't need to be found. It needs to be reactivated. And activation doesn't come through excavation. It comes through coherence. That's why the sinking wasn't the end. It was a delay. A sacred pause in the cycle of awakening. The earth had to reclaim the energy. The soul had to forget, so that remembering would mean something. So that you, here and now, could begin to reclaim what was never truly lost. Not through books, through resonance. The Atlanteans knew this. That's why they didn't try to save the continent. They saved the field, the vibrational archive encoded in water, in magnetism, in DNA. The real Atlantis isn't under the ocean. It's under the noise, beneath your thoughts, behind your eyes, waiting. Not all of it, of course. Some fragments were lost, some souls shattered, some codes corrupted. But the spiral never ends. The soul remembers. And as humanity accelerates again, into noise, into brilliance, into control, the pattern repeats, not to punish, to offer the choice again. Because the Atlantean cycle isn't a myth, it's a mirror. And the sinking? That was just the part of the story most people couldn't bear to continue. But the true ones, the ones who remember without proof, who feel without logic, they know. The story didn't end beneath the waves. It just changed dimension, and now it's surfacing again. They walk among you, not as rulers, not as mystics, but as echoes. The bloodlines that remember didn't inherit kingdoms. They inherited burdens, codes carried in their marrow, frequencies embedded in their bones. They don't all know what they hold. Some feel it as restlessness, others as grief, a few as the unbearable weight of truths they've never been told. But it's there, in their eyes, in their silence, in their refusal to forget what no one has said out loud. These bloodlines didn't form by accident. They were seeded intentionally, lovingly, by those who fled before the fall. The ancient priestesses, the record keepers, the last of the purity path. They carried memory not in scrolls, but in ceremony. Not in words, but in water, in rhythm, in lineage. They knew that one day the earth would rise again, and when she did, the codes would need vessels strong enough to hold them. Some settled near the Nile, others near the Andes, the Himalayas, the Pacific Rim. They blended with tribes, with cultures, with forgotten peoples. They didn't preach Atlantis. They preserved its resonance, through lullabies, through sacred tattoos, through stories told around firelight that children would dream about for lifetimes. They didn't need to remember the names. They only needed to remember the tone. Over time, the codes scattered. Colonization, genocide, forced conversions. Empire after empire attempted to erase what could not be understood. And still the bloodlines endured. Bent but not broken, hidden but not gone. Because DNA is stubborn, frequency is patient, and the soul never forgets the song, it only waits for the silence to return. Now those who carry the codes are waking. You might be one of them. You've always felt older than your age. At home in ruins, awake in dreams, drawn to symbols you've never studied, moved to tears by music you've never heard. You've tried to name it, you've tried to fit it into something logical, but it slips away every time, because what you're remembering wasn't learned in this life, it was lived in another. And that's why the world feels so strange, because the Atlantean cycle is reactivating. The pace, the brilliance, the seduction of progress, the disconnection from stillness. It's happening again. And the bloodlines that remember are being stirred, not to lead, but to anchor, not to teach, but to hold frequency, to remind the grid that another way exists. You are not here to prove Atlantis was real. You are here because it was, and what it seeded in you has started to bloom. Not everyone will understand. Most won't. They'll call it sensitivity, depression, intensity. But you'll know, because your body will light up when the old codes rise. Your heart will ache when people chase control. Your dreams will speak in symbols that never make sense but always feel true. You are not broken. You are encoded. And now that the cycle is turning again, the memory is no longer optional. It's rising whether you're ready or not. Because the blood remembers, and the earth is asking it to awaken. They are older than the histories written about them, older than the names they've been given. The Atlantean seeded temples weren't built as monuments. They were planted as frequency anchors, as vibrational portals, as tuning forks for the Earth's evolving field. You've seen them, walked among their stones, marveled at their symmetry. But you were never meant to look with your eyes. You were meant to feel them with your bones. Each temple was a node, a nexus of harmonic convergence, positioned not just with astronomical precision, but with vibrational intent. Aligned to stargates, ley lines, and telluric currents, mapped not with compasses, but with consciousness. The builders didn't calculate, they listened. They placed stones where the earth sang back, and when they finished, they sang into the stone. These temples were not just physical spaces, they were multidimensional devices. Some stored memory, others transmitted codes. A few served as gateways, entry points into deeper planes of the earth, or bridges to higher frequencies. They weren't meant to impress. They were meant to remember. Many of them lie silent now, misunderstood, reduced to tourist sites and broken mythologies, pyramids repainted by colonial theory, temples dismissed as primitive. But those who carry the resonance can still feel it. The hum beneath the noise, the shift in air as you enter, the undeniable sense that the stones are listening. The Atlanteans seeded these sites knowing what was coming. They understood the fall was inevitable, but they also understood the spiral. That consciousness would rise again, that humanity would forget, and then remember. And when that moment came, the temples would awaken. Not with lights or explosions, with subtlety, with frequency. You may have felt it. A sudden warmth in the chest at the foot of a ruin. An emotion that doesn't belong to you in the shadow of ancient stone. A vision, not yours, rushing into your awareness with no explanation. That's not fantasy. That's access. Because these temples weren't meant to be studied. They were meant to be entered. Not just physically, but vibrationally. You align with them. You remember through them. If you listen with your heart, they still speak. Some of them are hidden, not because of secrecy, but because of frequency. They sit in dimensions just beyond the physical eye. They appear in dreams, in spontaneous regressions, in moments when the veil thins and time folds. Others are submerged, some buried by Earth's own rebalancing. But all of them still exist, because nothing anchored in truth can be destroyed, only obscured, and they are waiting for resonance, for coherence, for the return of those who once built them, not in form, but in frequency. That might be you. You don't need credentials. You need silence. You don't need permission. You need presence, because the temples remember you even if you've forgotten them. And the moment your frequency matches theirs, the doorway opens. Not outward, but inward. Because the real temple was never the stone. It was what the stone awakened in you. They were never tombs. That story came much later, when memory had faded and mystery became threat. The pyramids weren't graves. They were instruments, architectural frequencies designed to tune the human soul. They didn't house the dead. They activated the living. The shape was not symbolic. It was functional. A pyramid is not just a triangle in 3 dimensions. It is a funnel for energy, a stabilizer of vibration, a geometric translation of consciousness itself. In Atlantis, the pyramid was understood not as a structure, but as a resonance chamber. Built not with stone alone, but with intent, with alignment, with star-mapped precision that modern tools still can't replicate. Each angle was a code, each block a conductor. The positioning wasn't arbitrary. It mirrored constellations, celestial rhythms, even the geometry of light as it bends through dimensions. These were not monuments. They were living technologies. And their purpose? To bridge the gap between matter and light, between density and spirit, between who you think you are and what you truly are. In the center of certain pyramids, especially those seeded directly by Atlantean lineages, there were resonance chambers, not empty spaces, but vibrational wombs. You didn't go there to speak, you went to remember. The sound inside those chambers wasn't audible, it was felt. A standing wave of energy calibrated to strip the ego, amplify the soul, and rewire the blueprint of your incarnational path. Initiates would lie in sarcophagus-shaped slabs, not coffins, but tuning beds. They would fast, breathe, surrender. The pyramid would do the rest. It would amplify their intention, magnify their unresolved patterns, bring to the surface whatever stood between them and coherence. It wasn't comfortable, but it was transformational. You didn't exit those chambers the same, and many weren't ready. Because the pyramids didn't cater to belief. They exposed truth. Later generations forgot, or misused them. or feared what they could no longer feel. And so the stories changed. The resonance faded, the entrances were sealed, the chambers fell silent. But not all of them. Some are still active, some never stopped humming. You won't find them on maps, not because they're hidden, but because their access is not physical. It's vibrational. If your field aligns, they reveal themselves. Sometimes in dreams, sometimes in travel. Sometimes in moments when time bends and space opens. You may have stood inside one already, feeling something stir in your spine, your chest, your bones. You may have wept without knowing why. That wasn't emotion. That was resonance. And the pyramids, they weren't reacting to you. They were recognizing you. Because what they were actually for wasn't just planetary stabilization or cosmic alignment. They were for you. For the return of memory. For the reactivation of what you once were. Before language, before forgetting, before the world convinced you to be small. They are not ancient, they are eternal, and they are waiting. They were not scribes, they were not librarians, they were guardians of vibration, keepers of a truth too vast to be spoken, too sacred to be stored in words. The records they preserved were not scrolls or tablets, they were frequencies, living fields of encoded memory. And the ones who hid them? They did so not out of fear, but out of foresight. They were called by many names across time, the silent watchers, the veil keepers, the cloaked ones. They wore no symbols, they held no rank. You wouldn't have noticed them in the high temples or at the crystal councils. But they were always there, quietly scanning, feeling the currents of the collective field, sensing when the vibrational infrastructure could no longer hold the truth it once carried. Because truth, at a certain frequency, becomes dangerous to distortion. Not because it harms, because it dissolves. And in a society increasingly built on projection and control, such dissolution was unbearable. The records weren't hidden in vaults, they were disassembled, transmuted, folded into the geometry of places, the pulse of certain crystals, the cells of living beings. Some fragments were embedded into the DNA of volunteers, souls who agreed to incarnate across millennia, carrying memory without knowing it. Others were stored in sound, ancient songs sung by shamans and seers who had no idea why the melody made people weep. The hiding wasn't cowardice, it was strategy. Atlantis was collapsing, not just physically, but energetically. To preserve the records in any fixed form would have doomed them to destruction or misuse. So the keepers scattered the codes like seeds, trusting the earth and time to bring them back when the soil of consciousness was ready. Some were encoded in architecture, not just in Egypt, but in places modern maps still call primitive. The records spoke through stone circles, through cave etchings, through inexplicable monuments aligned with stars we've forgotten how to see. They spoke through sound, intonations no longer understood, but still felt in the chest. They spoke through language, symbols that survived colonization and erasure, barely clinging to memory, but still pulsing beneath the surface. And they spoke through you. You are one of the records, not all of you, but something inside you. A dream you've had your whole life, a knowing that arrives without cause, a pattern you repeat that carries the weight of something older than trauma. You're not broken, you're encoded, and the ones who hid the records knew this moment would come. They saw us, now, here, on the cusp of remembering, a planet vibrating faster, a species facing its own illusion, a choice between control and coherence, noise and silence, forgetting and return. They didn't hide the records to keep them from you. They hid them in you, because when truth is buried in the soul, no empire can erase it. And when that truth stirs, through grief, through art, through longing, you begin to remember not just Atlantis, but why it had to fall, and why the memory was never meant to be passed down in books. It was meant to be awakened. Collapse has a tone. You can feel it before you see it. It enters like static in the soul, disorienting, dissonant, heavy. The frequency of ruin is not chaos, its imbalance sustained too long, its coherence ignored, its vibration stretched past its integrity until the field shatters under its own refusal to listen. Atlantis didn't fall in a single moment. It resonated its own demise. A slow drift in tone, a growing wobble in the grid, a hum beneath the cities that no one could name, but everyone could feel. They called it progress. But the frequency said otherwise, and the ones who could still hear, the few, knew the song was breaking. You have to understand this. Ruin isn't always loud. Sometimes it's soft. It creeps in through compromise, through convenience, through brilliance without balance. Atlantis became too fast, too bright, too synthetic. Its people forgot how to sit in silence, how to listen to the earth, how to slow down enough to sense the shift. The grids, once tuned with ceremony, began to vibrate artificially. Crystals were forced into overproduction. Soul tech was used without initiation. Emotional energy was no longer cleared, just redirected. And every time the system pushed forward without alignment, the field frayed. The earth warned them, not with anger, with frequency. Bird migrations reversed, weather patterns buckled. The animals began to flee the energy centers. The water shifted first, rising in some places, drying in others, refusing to be commanded. The oceans didn't seek revenge. They reflected the imbalance. The Atlanteans had used frequency to build. Now frequency would unbuild. It wasn't personal, it was harmonic law, because every civilization carries a tone. And when that tone no longer matches the soul of the earth, correction comes, not as punishment, but as realignment. Still, many clung to control. They built resonance dampeners, constructed domes to filter out unwanted vibrations, attempted to override natural harmonics with artificial ones. For a moment, it seemed to work. The grid stabilized, the cities calmed. But it was illusion. The frequency of ruin had only been muted, not transmuted. And what you silence without healing always returns, louder. Eventually, the distortion could no longer be held. The tone cracked, the pyramid grids misfired, the resonance towers began to feed back on themselves. Storms formed out of clear sky. Earthquakes began in places thought geologically inert. The vibrational infrastructure collapsed, not with fire, but with frequency. And the people? They responded the only way they knew how. Some tried to flee. Some tried to pray. Some tried to bargain with energies that no longer recognized their command. And some, those few who had prepared, entered into stillness. They lay down in the inner sanctums. They tuned their bodies to the final tone, not to escape, but to carry it forward. Because the frequency of ruin is not just an end, it's an opening. When a song dies, its echo travels further than the note ever could. And the echo of Atlantis, its beauty, its imbalance, its brilliance, its fall, has been vibrating ever since. You've heard it? In the sound of sirens that shake your nervous system, in the hum of machines that never sleep, in the quiet moments when you sense that something precious was lost a long time ago, and you don't know why you're the one mourning it. You're not broken, you're listening, and the echo you hear isn't grief, it's the call to remember what made the ruin inevitable. So it doesn't have to happen again. They say history is written by the victors, but what if the victors were time and forgetfulness? Atlantis wasn't erased because it failed. It was erased because it remembered too much. Its knowledge couldn't be assimilated by the linear mind, couldn't be archived in books without losing its essence. So history didn't forget Atlantis. History rejected it. The fall of Atlantis threatened the narratives that would follow, because if it was true, If humanity once mastered sound, light, energy, consciousness, then the whole myth of primitive beginnings collapses, and with it, the illusion of progress. What if we're not ascending, but circling? What if our ancestors weren't less evolved, but more integrated? Those who built the empires that came after couldn't allow that, not because they were evil, but because they needed legitimacy. So the Atlantean memory was buried, not by censorship, but by ridicule, by classification, by subtle distortions that made it look like fantasy, allegory, science fiction. The story was too dangerous. It challenged the foundation of control. That knowledge comes from institutions, that truth is external, that humanity must be led. Atlantis proved otherwise. It showed that sacred knowledge can live in silence, that healing can occur through sound, that time can be bent by consciousness, that spirit and matter are not enemies. They are co-creators. And so, slowly, deliberately, the memory was diffused. First into myth, Plato's dialogues, half mocking, half aching for remembrance. Then into fiction, lost continents, utopias drowned by hubris. Then into whispers, channeled fragments, dismissed by scholars, mocked by experts. The system made sure that to believe in Atlantis was to step outside the acceptable, to question not just history, but reality. And that was the point, because as long as the story remained marginal, the truth would remain inert. But stories have a pulse, and memory isn't passive. It waits, it weaves itself into art, into dreams, into music that stirs you without explanation. It lives in the questions no one can answer and the feelings no one can name. It survives not through evidence, but through resonance. You've felt it. That sense that something about this world is off, that we're missing a chapter, that beneath the concrete and noise is a quieter history, one that vibrates with elegance, sorrow, and memory. That's Atlantis. Not a city under the sea, but a truth under the surface. And history didn't erase it. We did. Because remembering means responsibility. It means realizing that we've done this before. Built wonders. Forgot soul. Fallen. And now, as the spiral turns again, the memory rises. Not to haunt, to offer choice. Because history isn't linear, it's harmonic. And the Song of Atlantis is returning to the surface. Not through textbooks, but through you. They're not spirits in the haunted sense. They're not lost souls looking for rest. The ghosts in the grid are frequencies, fragments of consciousness imprinted into the energetic scaffolding of the earth. They are echoes of Atlantis, pulsing through the places where the veil is thin. Not to scare, to speak. These ghosts don't wear faces. They arrive as sensations. The sudden heaviness in a city plaza built on ancient stone. The flicker of nausea near a monument whose geometry feels wrong. The inexplicable emotion that overtakes you as you walk into a room, a temple, a field. That's not yours. That's memory stored in the grid. You see, Atlantis didn't just collapse in space. It collapsed in time, and its trauma imprinted itself into the Earth's vibrational matrix. The same grid that once carried healing, sound, and sacred codes began to carry unresolved grief. When the pyramids fell silent, when the temples were misused, when the songs turned synthetic, the frequencies didn't vanish. They fractured. And fractured frequencies become residue. Those residues didn't stay in Atlantis. When the continent dispersed, so did the grid echoes, across tectonic plates, through ocean currents, into the magnetic web that links all sacred sites on Earth. Now, the grief of Atlantis lives in places far from its origin, beneath cathedrals, inside data centers, under cities that hum with constant electric dissonance. Some of you are sensitive enough to feel it. You've mistaken it for anxiety, for fatigue, for overwhelm. But what you're sensing isn't always yours. It's collective. an old grief still vibrating in the architecture of our world. Engineers will talk of EMFs, mystics will speak of psychic imprints. You will know it as a presence, not dark, just disoriented. The ghosts in the grid are not malevolent. They are confused, stuck in loops. They are fragments of what Atlantis didn't integrate, visions that were never fulfilled, ceremonies that were interrupted, knowledge that had no vessel to receive it when the collapse came. And now, as the planetary field shifts, those fragments are surfacing. They're asking to be witnessed, to be felt, to be freed, not by ritual alone, but by coherence. The solution is not to fight them or fear them. It is to stabilize your own field enough that their dissonance does not become your distortion. You are the tuning fork. When your heart is clear, your mind still, your presence rooted, you become the healing they never received. You become the temple that wasn't destroyed. And in your coherence, the ghosts begin to remember that they, too, were light. They weren't meant to haunt. They were meant to awaken. Atlantis wasn't just a past. It was a future we glimpsed and rejected. Not consciously, not with malice, but with fear. We saw what was possible, a world where matter responded to thought, where cities pulsed with harmony, where souls incarnated fully aware of why they came. And in the very same breath, we saw what it cost. Presence, humility, integration. The light was too pure, the mirror too honest. And so, we turned away. The collapse wasn't just a fall, it was a choice, a collective moment where the Atlantean field decided. Not yet. Not like this. We weren't ready to hold that much light without distortion, to wield that much power without projection. The civilization we called Atlantis became a memory because it was too close to the soul and too far from the heart. But that future didn't disappear. It paused. The codes remained. The dream buried itself in myth, in geometry, in song. And now, as the spiral returns, we stand at the threshold again. The same technologies are re-emerging. Energy without wires, communication through frequency, consciousness expanding beyond the body. We are remembering, piece by piece, the promise of what we once were. But so too are we repeating the same seductions, speed over stillness, mastery without maturity, advancement without anchoring. The same impulses that unraveled Atlantis whisper through our devices, our cities, our dreams of artificial gods and engineered bliss. The danger isn't in the tools. It never was. The danger is in forgetting again that the soul cannot be bypassed. The Atlanteans saw all this. They encoded the memory not to warn, but to prepare. So that when the future returned, we might choose differently. Not to turn away from light, but to walk into it slowly, with reverence. To bring our shadow with us this time. To build not with ego, but with empathy. With earth. The denied future is still waiting. You feel it, don't you? In the tension between your visions and your grief, in the pull between transcendence and tenderness. You're here because your soul remembers what Atlantis glimpsed and what it failed to become. You didn't come to repeat the cycle. You came to complete it, not by rejecting technology or growth or brilliance, but by grounding it in love. Because this time, the future must include the body, the breath, the tears, the stillness. This time, the light must be felt, not just seen. And the only way to step into that future is to first stand fully in the memory of what came before, not to mourn it, to reclaim it. Because the Atlantean future was never denied, it was delayed. And now it's arriving again. They were never meant to lead, only to remind. The memory keepers were the quiet ones, the ones who walked between timelines with eyes that seemed too old, too soft, too still. They weren't prophets or priests. They were resonance holders, guardians of a frequency that could not be written, only lived. They vanished when Atlantis fell, not into death, but into dispersion. They scattered across the earth, incarnating into bloodlines that would carry their codes forward through centuries of silence. They hid in plain sight, artists, midwives, poets, wanderers, misfits. They kept no records in books, but carried vibrations in their bones. Some of them forgot. Some of them fractured. But none of them lost the seed. And now, as the earth begins to vibrate faster, as the human field stirs with the ache of something long buried, the memory keepers are returning. You might be one. You've always known things you couldn't explain. Felt grief that wasn't yours. Looked into the stars not with curiosity but with recognition. The timelines you speak of aren't theories. They are memories. The rituals that move you aren't hobbies. They are activations. You're not searching for Atlantis. You are it. You carry pieces of the song that was silenced, and now the melody is beginning to rise again. Not all at once, but in fragments. A word here, a tone there, a sudden knowing that pours through your body like light. You feel insane one moment and perfectly aligned the next. This is what awakening memory feels like. Not certainty, frequency. The return of the memory keepers isn't a movement, it's a vibration. You won't see it on the news. It doesn't announce itself. It emerges through coherence, through humility, through the willingness to live the truth of what you remember, even when no one else sees it. And as more of you return, the field shifts, not because of volume, but because of resonance. One keeper standing fully in remembrance has more impact than 1,000 shouting theories. Because the truth doesn't need defense, it needs embodiment. The others are waking too. You'll know them by the way they pause before speaking, by the way they feel familiar in your bones. You'll know them in circles, in dreams, in synchronicities that don't make sense but change everything. You were never meant to wake alone. You were meant to be found. And now the grid is lighting up again. The same energetic web that once connected the Atlantean temples is reactivating, not through machines, but through people, through memory keepers becoming temples in flesh. And as you anchor this remembrance, you are not resurrecting the past. You are weaving the future, one encoded moment at a time. It never stopped. Even after the fall, after the silence, after the temples collapsed and the songs were swallowed, the water kept speaking. Because water doesn't forget. It records. It remembers not in language but in vibration. Every rise and fall of a civilization, every prayer whispered, every collapse of a soul into grief or awakening, water holds it all. The oceans are the memory banks of Earth. And Atlantis? It's still there, not as ruins beneath the waves, but as resonance within them. Every wave that touches your feet, every tear that escapes your eye, carries particles of a story that hasn't ended. You don't need to dive deep to find it. You just need to get quiet enough to feel it moving inside you. The Atlanteans knew this. Their technologies worked with water, not against it. They tuned it with sound, charged it with crystalline harmonics, used it as a mirror, a transmitter, a gateway. Water was sacred not because of myth, but because of memory. They drank it with reverence, bathed in it as initiation, spoke to it as teacher, and in return, water remembered them. When the collapse began, it was water that carried the final tones. Into the sea, into the clouds, into the bloodstreams of the ones who would one day wake again. And now it speaks, not in thunder but in rhythm, in the tide pulling at your nervous system, in the rain that softens you for no reason, in the moment you stare at the ocean and feel like something is trying to come through, not thought, but knowing. That knowing is real, because water speaks to those who listen not with their minds, but with their field. It bypasses logic. It moves into the subtle body. It reawakens dormant codes, not by activation, but by resonance. It shows you what you already carry. That's why you cry near water and don't know why. That's why certain rivers make you ache. That's why your best thoughts come in the shower. It's not random. It's remembering. And the memory doesn't need to be clear. It only needs to be felt. Because Atlantis was not just lost to time, it was folded into tide. And as more of you return to silence, to breath, to surrender, the water begins to respond. The rivers quicken, the oceans shimmer. The cells in your body begin to hum with what they always knew. You are not separate from the water. You are its voice, and the more you listen, the more clearly it speaks. Not of the past, but of what is rising again. You carry it, not as guilt, but as imprint. The shadow of Atlantis lives in the human psyche, not because of what was done, but because of what was denied. The betrayal of balance, the obsession with light at the expense of depth, the hunger for power masked as progress. These were not just Atlantean choices, they are human ones, and they echo still. Atlantis wasn't destroyed by evil. It was dismantled by avoidance, by brilliance that outran integration, by love of the stars that forgot the soil. And that forgetting became a pattern, a loop etched into the subconscious of a species that once held cosmic memory and chose to suppress it. You see it today, in the urge to escape instead of embody, in the chase for peak experience without grounding, in the way technology accelerates while emotional maturity lags behind. The Atlantean trauma became a collective scar, and scar tissue doesn't feel. It numbs, it protects, and until it is touched with gentleness, it cannot heal. The shadow of Atlantis is not the fall. It's the fear that if we awaken fully again, we will fall again. That the soul cannot be trusted with power. That the earth cannot support the light we carry. That truth, once remembered, will destroy everything we've built. This is the wound behind the wounds. The reason many of you hesitate, hold back, sabotage. You're not lazy. You're not confused. You're ancient. And part of you remembers what happens when too much light meets an unintegrated shadow. But here's what's different now. You are no longer alone. You are not being asked to carry it all. And the shadow you feel is not yours to battle. It's yours to integrate. Integration doesn't look like perfection. It looks like slowness, stillness, the courage to sit with the grief that doesn't have a name, the humility to feel your own resistance without bypassing it with brilliance. Atlantis tried to escape the shadow. You must walk into it. Because the shadow is not the enemy. It is the part of you that still remembers what happened and is begging you to choose differently this time. You don't need to collapse again to evolve. You don't need to explode to awaken. You need to return to earth, to silence, to the breath inside the breath. The shadow is not here to stop you. It is here to remind you that real power is not what you hold. It's what you're willing to feel. And when you feel it fully, not flinch from it, not reframe it, but sit inside it until it softens. Atlantis heals through you. Not in myth, in the human psyche, where it always lived, not all of you, but many. Enough to matter, enough for the ache to make sense. You've wondered why this story pulls you, why the word Atlantis stirs something ancient and tender inside your chest. It's not fascination, it's memory. You were there. Maybe not in the cities of light, maybe not in the high councils, but you walked those lands, felt those tones, drank that water. You might have been a healer, a builder, a child who danced in the resonance chambers before words were needed. Or maybe you were one of the ones who watched the light bend too far, who felt the hum of the earth shift, who couldn't stop the unraveling but tried anyway. You may have fallen with it. You may have left before it fell. You may have vowed never to forget or to never remember again. And now here you are, remembering. Not in full, not clearly, but deeply. You feel it in the parts of yourself that don't respond to logic, in the chills that come when certain truths are spoken, in the strange sense that something you've never seen is somehow your home. This is not reincarnation as trivia. This is resonance. The soul doesn't carry names. It carries frequencies, patterns, lessons unfinished, cycles awaiting completion. And if you're reading this now, it's not by accident. Something in you is reactivating. Something Atlantean, something luminous. You are not just remembering what was. You are retrieving who you were. The artist who painted with vibration. The priestess who held silence as medicine. The engineer who wove light into form. The wanderer who chose to carry the codes into the dark. You were there. And you chose to come again. Not to repeat. To remember. To feel the weight of that fall, not as punishment but as wisdom. To walk the earth again not as a seeker, but as a keeper. To reclaim what was lost, not in technology but in presence. The grids are waking. The memories are rising. The others are finding you, not always in words, but in eyes that hold something familiar, something eternal. You were there. And now you are here. Because it's time, not to rebuild Atlantis, but to rise with what it came to teach. It was never gone, only buried, whispered between lifetimes, sung beneath the breath of waves. The story of Atlantis did not vanish beneath the ocean. It entered the bloodstream of the earth, encoded in vibration, in myth, in you. And now it finishes not with an ending, but with a return. You were never meant to just read this story. You were meant to remember it. And not because Atlantis was perfect. It wasn't. It soared, and it fell. It reached into the heavens but forgot its roots. It mastered sound but neglected stillness. It built marvels but lost the meaning behind them. And in doing so, it mirrored us all. That's why this story matters. Because it is not history, it is instruction. The spiral has brought you here again, full circle, another era of brilliance, another edge of acceleration, another civilization faced with the choice, integrate or collapse, ascend or fracture, remember or forget. But this time you are awake. This time you've felt the echo of what once was and understood that it's not prophecy, it's a mirror. What Atlantis tried to become is not dead. It's unfolding. In your hands, in your nervous system, in the space between your inhale and the Earth's pulse. You were never just a student of this knowledge. You were always a keeper of it. The temples live in your breath now. The codes hum in your silence. The songs ripple through your tears. And the grids, the real ones, don't need machines to activate. They need coherence, presence, remembrance. So if you feel overwhelmed, good. If you feel unworthy, better. If you feel cracked wide open with no idea what's next, you're exactly where the spiral placed you. Because Atlantis wasn't meant to rise again in stone. It was meant to rise in you, and now it has.